a black businesswoman, fresh off a successful deal that could reshape her company's future, walks into a luxury boutique in downtown Paris to celebrate. But within minutes, everything shifts. A store clerk follows her, eyes sharp with suspicion, and accuses her of attempting to use a fraudulent card despite her account holding more than enough. Humiliated, she prepares to leave quietly. But just as she reaches the door, the store manager steps in. What happens next flips the script entirely, igniting a chain of events that neither the clerk nor anyone in that store saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, tell me, have you ever been judged before someone even knew your name? Drop a comment below, and if this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. Your support helps bring stories of resilience and justice to light. Now, let's begin. The late afternoon sun sat heavy over the private airstrip, hanging low and wide as if it, too, felt the weight of the day. Amara Lewis stepped out of the black Mercedes, her heels clicking softly against the tarmac. She moved with the kind of grace that only came from years of practice, not the rehearsed poise of privilege, but the deliberate steps of someone who had learned, over time, that every room she entered had to be claimed. Her white blazer caught the light, its edges sharp, and her silk scarf fluttered just slightly in the breeze. Around her, the world was still save for the eyes. She felt them without looking. The ground crew, the attendants by the lounge windows, the security guards posted at the edge of the runway, all watching her with that same quiet calculation. They weren't hostile, not yet, but that was the trouble with the kind of prejudice Amara had grown used to. It rarely announced itself with a shout. More often, it slithered in through polite smiles, through small hesitations and narrowed glances. It whispered behind closed doors and flourished in the spaces where doubt was allowed to fester. As Amara walked toward the sleek, silver jet waiting for her, she let the weight of those glances roll off her back. There were more important things ahead. This flight wasn't just another luxury. It was business, the kind that shifted futures. Her independent fashion line was teetering on the edge of a European expansion deal that could catapult it into international markets. Still, the moment she neared the plane, Amara felt the shift. A tall figure stepped into view at the base of the stairs. His uniform pressed, his cap angled just so. The posture, the slight forward lean of the shoulders, the way his hands gripped the clipboard a little too tightly, Amara recognized all of it. Captain William Hayes. He was waiting for her. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Can I help you?" Amara's steps slowed. She let her eyes meet his, refusing to offer the smallest gesture of deference. "I'm Amara Lewis. This is my jet. I believe everything is in order." For a fleeting second, something flickered across his face, surprise. Maybe, but surprise, Amara knew, was rarely innocent. His eyes dragged over her blazer, down to the heels she wore, then back up to the soft curls that framed her face. There was no mistaking it now. He was trying to fit her into a box that didn't quite match the one he had been expecting. "Your jet," he repeated, as if trying the words on for size. "Yes," Amara replied, her voice steady. "Is there an issue?" The pilot didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the lounge behind her, as if searching for someone else, someone who might explain why she was standing there, claiming ownership of something he clearly believed belonged to someone else. "I'll need to see some proof of ownership," he said, finally. Amara tilted her head, just slightly. She wasn't surprised, but that didn't mean she wasn't tired. "I've already checked in. My reservation should be on file. I'd prefer something more direct," Hayes replied. There was nothing outright accusatory in his voice, but Amara could hear it anyway, that same low thrum of doubt that had followed her for years. "You don't belong here. Not like this. Not without permission." Amara could feel the quiet tension humming beneath the surface. The thing about these moments was that they were small, tiny, even, but if you let them grow, if you let them pass unchecked, they had a way of planting roots. And once they did, they spread. So she didn't offer another smile. Instead, she reached into her handbag and pulled out the printed reservation. She handed it to him, watching carefully as his eyes scanned the document. He barely glanced at it. "Anyone can print something like this," he said. Amara's grip tightened on the handle of her bag. "And yet, not just anyone can book this flight through my husband's company," she replied coolly. There it was, the mention of Marcus Lewis, a name that often held more weight in rooms like this than her own. Hayes' smirk didn't falter, but the pause that followed was longer than before. She could see the wheels turning. "Well," he said after a beat. "It's standard protocol. Ma'am, surely you understand." Amara held his gaze, letting the silence between them stretch until it felt sharp enough to cut. "I understand plenty, Captain," she said at last, "and I suggest you call Marcus Lewis directly if you need further confirmation." "I'll wait." She could see the hesitation now, the slight tightening of his jaw. The way his eyes flicked back toward the jet as if weighing whether this was a battle worth fighting. "I'll make the call," Hayes said, but there was a reluctant edge to his voice. Amara nodded, taking a step back. As she waited, the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tarmac. She stood alone, but not unsteady. These battles weren't new, and as the wind shifted, she could hear it, that faint, almost imperceptible murmur among the staff behind her. They were waiting to see how this would end. The airstrip felt quieter as the minutes stretched. Amara stood near the base of the jet's staircase, the warm press of the evening sun on her shoulders doing little to ease the weight that had begun to settle in her chest. Captain Hayes had retreated a few steps away, phone pressed to his ear, his gaze flicking toward her, occasionally wary, but never apologetic. She'd seen that look before. Not anger, not open hostility, but doubt. Sharp and cold, the kind of doubt that didn't need words to make itself understood. Amara crossed her arms, careful not to let her posture slacken. These moments, she knew, demanded stillness. In the face of doubt, composure was its own form of defiance. A soft breeze rustled through the air, carrying with it the faint hum of distant engines and the muffled chatter of staff inside the lounge. She could feel them watching through the large glass windows, stealing glances between duties. Not one of them stepped forward. Hayes lowered the phone after a brief exchange, his face unreadable. For a second, Amara thought perhaps that would be the end of it. Perhaps Marcus's voice had been enough to cut through the haze of suspicion. But as Hayes stepped forward, clipboard in hand, the smirk had returned, faint but undeniable. "Your husband confirmed the booking," he said. His words held the clipped precision of someone offering compliance, not concession. "But I hope you understand, ma'am, security protocols are for everyone." Everyone. Amara's gaze didn't waver. She recognized the weaponizing of that word, how it was used to mask discomfort as fairness. "That's reassuring," she replied, her voice even. "I'd hate to think those protocols look different depending on who's standing in front of you." There was a pause just long enough for the meaning to sink in. Hayes didn't respond, but the slight shift of his eyes was enough. "Enjoy your flight," he said finally, stepping aside to clear the stairs. Amara ascended slowly, each step deliberate. But before she crossed the threshold, she turned, her gaze meeting his. "I will," she said, "and I expect the same professionalism for every client that comes after me." Hayes offered no reply, only a curt nod, but Amara knew better than to mistake silence for resolution. Inside the cabin, the hush felt heavier than usual. The plush leather seats and polished wood surfaces gleamed under the soft cabin lights. A quiet luxury meant to soothe. But Amara's reflection in the window told a different story. Her shoulders were squared, her expression calm, but beneath it, something simmered. The engines roared softly to life as the jet prepared for departure. Amara fastened her seatbelt, smoothing the fabric of her blazer. Her phone buzzed quietly against the armrest. Marcus's name lit up the screen. She answered on the first ring. "Everything okay now?" His voice was warm, but there was tension beneath it. "Yes," Amara replied, her voice softer than she intended. "For now." Marcus sighed. "I spoke to Hayes directly. He said it was a misunderstanding." Amara's lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't, but I handled it." "I know you did." Marcus paused. "I'll deal with him when I'm back. You shouldn't have to go through that." "I appreciate it," Amara said. She glanced out the window, watching as the runway lights flickered past. But this wasn't the first time. And it won't be the last. Marcus hesitated. "It should be, though." Amara smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "Maybe, but I'm not holding my breath." The call ended with quiet goodbyes, leaving Amara alone with her thoughts. As the jet climbed higher into the evening sky, Amara closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engine settle her. But somewhere, beneath the steady rhythm of flight, her mind wandered back to the runway, to Hayes' eyes narrowing as she approached. The thing about prejudice, Amara thought, was that it wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was the quietest voice in the room, the one that insisted on proof when none was required. That hesitated when certainty was expected. And sometimes, the most dangerous part wasn't the doubt itself but how easily it was explained away. The hum of the jet engines was a low and steady comfort. But Amara Lewis found no rest in it. She sat by the window, one hand resting lightly against the armrest, her thumb tracing small circles over the leather. The sky outside was a deep and endless blue, fading slowly into the darker hues of approaching night. From up here, the world looked quiet. Distance had a way of disguising unrest. The cabin was empty, save for her and the flight attendant who moved soundlessly through the space. She brought a glass of water without being asked, setting it gently on the small table beside Amara. There was a warmth to her presence, a quiet professionalism that stood in stark contrast to the coldness on the tarmac. Amara offered a polite thank you, but even as she lifted the glass to her lips, she could feel the lingering weight of the encounter below. Hayes' voice still echoed in her mind, as clear as if he were seated across from her. Security protocols are for everyone. It wasn't the words that unsettled her, it was the ease with which he had said them. How familiar it all felt. She could still recall the first time something like this happened. She'd been 19, fresh out of college, standing in the lobby of a company where she had landed an internship. They mistook her for a messenger, sent her to the service entrance, and when she tried to correct them, there had been that same flicker of doubt in their eyes. No outright hostility, just the soft undercurrent of disbelief. A decade later, she sat on a private jet, the picture of success, and still the same questions lingered in the air. Amara set the glass down, her reflection faint in the window beside her. Somewhere between the clouds, her phone buzzed again. She reached for it, half expecting Marcus, but instead, the message came from an unfamiliar number. Ms. Lewis, this is Lisa Turner from the airstrip. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened today. I've already submitted the report, and I'll ensure this doesn't happen again. Amara stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone aside. Lisa had seemed nervous when Marcus spoke to her, apologetic but careful, as if even acknowledging the issue out loud was somehow dangerous. Amara understood that kind of fear. It was the fear of rocking the boat, of pulling too hard on strings tied to things no one wanted to unravel. The attendant reappeared, a soft smile lingering at the corner of her lips. Mrs. Lewis, will you be needing anything else before we descend? Amara shook her head gently. No, thank you, I'm fine. The woman hesitated for a brief second, then nodded, disappearing down the narrow aisle. The cabin grew quiet again. But just as Amara closed her eyes, the speaker above her head crackled to life. Mrs. Lewis? It was Hayes' voice. Could you join me in the cockpit for a moment? There's something you should see. Amara's eyes snapped open. There was no turbulence. The flight was smooth, calm, yet something in the tone of his voice told her this wasn't about the jet. It was about something else. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she made her way forward, the narrow corridor of the jet stretching longer than it should have. When she reached the cockpit, Hayes was seated, eyes straight ahead, his hands lightly gripping the controls. He didn't turn to greet her. Everything all right, Captain? Amara asked, keeping her tone neutral. Hayes glanced sideways, his eyes sharp but distant, like he was watching her from behind a glass wall. I thought you might want to know, he said quietly. Your husband made it clear I wouldn't be flying for his company again after today. Amara's brows lifted slightly. I wasn't aware Marcus discussed personnel decisions mid-flight. Hayes smirked, but there was no humor in it. Not directly, but people like him, they make themselves understood without having to say much. Don't they? The way he said people like him made Amara's skin prickle. She stepped forward slightly, folding her arms. Is there something you'd like to say, Captain? He let out a short breath, finally turning toward her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of something unspoken, something Amara recognized. It's just curious, Hayes said after a pause. You fly private, wear the right clothes, carry the right name, but no matter how high you climb, there's always that chip on your shoulder. Isn't there? Amara stared at him for a long moment, feeling the quiet hum of the engines beneath her feet. That chip, she said, her voice soft but deliberate, isn't something I placed there. It's the weight of every door I've had to push open with both hands. Hayes looked away, pretending to check the flight controls. "You can return to your seat." "Ma'am," he said flatly. Amara didn't move. "You know," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "People like you don't believe you're part of the problem. You think because you didn't shout, because you didn't raise a hand, you stand clean. But prejudice doesn't always walk through the front door. Sometimes, it slips in quietly through the cracks." Hayes stiffened slightly, but he said nothing. "Marcus may decide not to let you fly again," Amara continued, "but you'll find work elsewhere. You always do. And maybe next time, it won't be me standing here." She took a slow step back. "But I promise you," she added, her gaze steady, "one day it will be." Amara returned to her seat. The tension still thick in the air. But as the jet descended slowly toward the city lights below, she felt lighter. Sometimes, it wasn't about winning the fight. Sometimes, it was about making sure the other side knew there was one. The jet touched down softly, wheels gliding along the runway with the kind of grace only machines seemed to possess. As Amara felt the gentle pull of the descent, she found herself watching the skyline of Paris through the cabin window. The city sprawled out beneath the fading dusk. Yet, despite the beauty below, her reflection stared back at her tired, yet composed, the kind of composure that only comes from years of forced restraint. She remained seated as the engines quieted and the flight attendant returned with a polite smile. Offering to assist with her luggage, Amara waved her off gently. As she rose, smoothing her blazer, the pilot's door creaked open behind her. Hayes lingered in the narrow space of the cockpit doorway, arms folded, leaning slightly as if this were his home and she was merely visiting. He didn't speak, but there was something familiar in his gaze, the slight tilt of the head, the soft curl of disbelief that hadn't left since she first arrived at the airstrip. Amara met his eyes briefly but said nothing. She had learned long ago that certain battles didn't need words. The stairs unfolded beneath her, and as she stepped down onto the Parisian tarmac, the cool air greeted her like an old friend. Marcus was waiting near the black car parked nearby, the soft hum of the city stretching beyond the gates. His smile was warm, but she could tell by the way his brow creased that he'd been following the events more closely than she anticipated. "Long flight?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. Amara nodded. "Long enough." He opened the car door for her, and as she slid inside, she glanced once more toward the jet. Hayes remained at the top of the staircase, eyes fixed on her, though his posture had shifted, not relaxed, but something closer to resignation. Marcus followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'll handle it," he said, as if reading her mind. Amara shook her head. "It's already handled. He knows now." Marcus didn't press further. The car slipped out of the airstrip, Paris glowing softly in the distance. But Amara could still feel the weight of that gaze behind her. The next morning, the city woke gently, light spilling through the tall hotel windows. Amara sat on the edge of the bed, still in her robe, cradling a cup of coffee in both hands. Marcus was by the desk, already immersed in work. His suit jacket was slung over the back of the chair, sleeves rolled up as he typed briskly. "You were quiet last night," he said without looking up. Amara took a slow sip of coffee, watching the steam rise between her fingers. "I was thinking," she admitted, "about how easy it is for men like Hayes to walk away." Marcus glanced up then, his eyes sharp. "You think he'll just keep flying for someone else?" Amara's lips pressed into a thin line. "I think he'll convince himself he wasn't wrong." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And you think that matters?" She set the cup down gently, the ceramic clinking faintly against the saucer. "Yes," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "Because it's not about him. It's about the next woman who walks up to a jet she rightfully owns and still has to answer for it. It's about the silence after the apology, the part where nothing changes." Marcus didn't respond immediately, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. They both knew the truth. Men like Hayes didn't disappear. They adjusted. They shifted just enough to remain part of the machinery. Later that afternoon, Amara's meeting with the European executives unfolded in the towering glass building near the Seine. The boardroom was a modern marvel, sleek, open, and painfully bright. 12 faces, carefully neutral, stared back at her as she presented. Her voice never wavered, her pitch refined and unrelenting. Every number was precise, every slide carefully crafted. Yet, even as she spoke, Amara could feel the weight beneath the surface, the way some eyes lingered longer than necessary. The way others flicked to Marcus when she answered questions. Doubt is never loud. It whispered beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. By the time she finished, Elena Russo, the CEO, offered a polite nod, though her gaze remained guarded. Impressive, Elena said, leaning forward slightly, but expanding into Europe at this scale is ambitious. Our clients are discerning. Amara smiled faintly. That's why I'm here, she replied. I built a brand around people who've been overlooked. I'm not concerned with what's familiar. I'm interested in what's possible. For a moment, the room was still. Then, slowly, Elena's lips curved into the faintest smile. Perhaps you should be, she said. We'll review the details, but I imagine we'll find room for collaboration. Amara inclined her head in polite acknowledgement. But as the meeting adjourned and the boardroom emptied, Marcus lingered near the window, watching the city below. Not bad, he said softly. It wasn't good either, Amara replied, collecting her things. Marcus turned to face her. You closed the deal. Isn't that enough? Amara paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. It's never enough, she said quietly. That's the thing, Marcus. We can win the deal. Fly the jet. Sit at the table, but the room still questions why we're there in the first place. Marcus stepped closer, brushing his thumb gently over her knuckles. And yet, he said, you're still here. Amara's gaze lifted to meet his. Yes, she said softly, I am. As they stepped back into the streets of Paris, Amara realized the battles she fought weren't the kind you won outright. They were the kind you endured, pressing forward inch by inch. And perhaps that was the point. To exist, to stand firm, that, in itself, was a revolution. The Parisian morning held a brittle kind of quiet. The sun filtered softly through iron-railed balconies, stretching long shadows across cobblestone streets below. Amara Lewis sat at the small table by the window of her hotel suite, watching the city awaken beneath her. The day felt delicate, as if something unseen might tip the scales at any moment. Marcus stood behind her, sipping his espresso. His eyes traced the skyline. But Amara knew his mind was elsewhere. Elena seemed impressed yesterday, Marcus said, setting his cup down with deliberate care. That's a win. Amara smiled faintly but didn't turn from the window. Impressed isn't signed, she replied. She'll sign, Marcus said with certainty. She wouldn't have let the meeting run that long if she wasn't serious. Amara wanted to believe him. But experience had taught her that the length of a meeting didn't always measure the depth of intention. Sometimes, it was just a polite way to say no without closing the door all the way. Marcus crossed the room, leaning lightly against the edge of the table. His gaze met hers, soft but probing. You don't trust it, he said. Amara set down her coffee, fingers tightening briefly around the rim of the porcelain cup. I trust Elena, she said slowly. I don't trust the people she has to convince. Marcus didn't respond right away, but his silence was heavy with understanding. Amara looked at him then. Really looked. His suit was pressed perfectly. His tie knotted just so everything about him clean, polished. Men like Marcus knew how to navigate these rooms. But even they weren't immune to the second glances. The questions asked without words. You think this fight ends at the boardroom table? Amara said quietly. It doesn't. It just shifts shape. Marcus exhaled, running a hand over his beard. I know. Later that afternoon, Amara found herself alone in the hotel lobby, waiting for Marcus to finish a call. She watched as guests filtered in and out, the soft clatter of heels against marble filling the space. Across the room, a man approached the concierge. He was well dressed, older, the kind of face that suggested old money and old expectations. Amara wouldn't have noticed him at all if not for the way his eyes flicked toward her. Not directly, just enough. The kind of glance that pretended to be casual but lingered a second too long. She didn't look away. The man's gaze returned to the concierge. But something in the air shifted. The subtle acknowledgement of her presence not as a guest, but as a curiosity. Amara smoothed the lapel of her blazer, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of it. Marcus appeared at her side moments later. Car's ready, he said, pressing a light hand to the small of her back. As they stepped toward the entrance, Amara felt the man's gaze trail behind them. The afternoon meeting with Elena Russo was set in one of Paris's older office buildings' stone walls. High ceilings, The kind of architecture meant to remind you that time had passed through this space and left certain rules behind. Amara stepped through the doors with Marcus at her side. But she could feel the air shift the moment they entered. Eyes flicked up from desks. A receptionist's hand hovered over the phone just a second longer than necessary. It was the soft, familiar current that followed them into rooms like these, as if the space itself exhaled, waiting for them to explain why they had arrived. Alina's office was at the end of a long corridor, glass walls framing the city skyline beyond. She rose when they entered, her silver hair catching the light. "Amara," Elena said warmly, extending a hand. "I wasn't expecting you until later this afternoon." Amara smiled, shaking her hand firmly. "I thought we might take the chance to finalize a few details," she said smoothly. Elena gestured to the table near the window, and the three of them settled in. For the next half hour, Amara presented. Her words were sharp but measured, and Marcus occasionally added to the conversation, reinforcing points with ease. But as Amara spoke, she could feel it. The way Elena's assistant hesitated outside the glass door, eyes flicking inside more often than usual. The way Elena occasionally glanced toward Marcus as if double-checking his agreement. It wasn't hostility. It was the quiet gravity of doubt, the kind that pulled subtly at the edges of every opportunity. Elena's smile never faded, but when the meeting concluded, her words were careful. "I'll review everything and get back to you by tomorrow," she said. Amara nodded, though she knew this wasn't about needing more time. The door was open, but only just. That evening, Amara sat in the hotel lounge, glass of wine resting lightly between her fingers. Marcus had gone to take another call, leaving her alone with the soft hum of conversation around her. Across the room, the man from earlier lingered near the bar, speaking with two others. Their laughter carried faintly, but Amara noticed the way his eyes cut toward her once again. She held his gaze this time, not out of defiance but out of necessity. "You learn to see the world as it sees you." Moments later, Marcus returned, pressing a kiss to her temple as he sat down. "Long day," he murmured. Amara hummed softly in agreement, swirling the wine in her glass. The man at the bar glanced toward them once more, but this time, Amara smiled faintly. Marcus followed her gaze, his brows furrowing slightly. "Something I should know about?" Amara shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Just someone who thinks he knows me." Marcus leaned back, eyes narrowing toward the bar. "Does he?" "No," Amara said, taking another slow sip. "But I think that bothers him more than anything else." Marcus chuckled, the tension easing slightly. And as the city lights flickered outside, Amara felt the weight of those glances lessen, not because they had disappeared, but because she had decided they would not shape her. The world had a way of closing doors, but Amara had spent her life learning how to hold them open. Paris, in the early morning, whispered with a kind of stillness that made the city seem softer, more forgiving. The streets were nearly empty as Amara Lewis watched from the balcony of her hotel suite. The iron railing pressed cool against her palms, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine that the day ahead would be ordinary. But Amara had never known the luxury of ordinary days. The meeting with Elena Russo loomed on the horizon like a storm cloud that didn't belong to the season. She had faced rooms like this before, where every word felt weighed, every movement examined as if she were some artifact that had wandered into the wrong museum. And yet, she knew she would walk into that room, as she always had, because the world did not stop for women like Amara. It only moved faster, expecting them to keep pace. Marcus stirred inside, the faint rustle of sheets breaking the silence behind her. When he appeared at the balcony doorway, his hair was tousled, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You're thinking too hard," he said, leaning against the frame. Amara smirked faintly but didn't turn. "I prefer to call it preparing." Marcus crossed the room and stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Elena wouldn't have invited us back if she wasn't serious." "Maybe," Amara replied, "but the invitation isn't the decision. Is it?" Marcus sighed, shifting slightly. His reflection flickered in the glass window beside them. Two silhouettes standing against a city that didn't know their names but had already decided their worth. "It'll work out," Marcus said, but there was hesitation beneath his words, not because he doubted Amara's ability, but because he understood the world too well to trust it. Amara's gaze drifted downward, watching a delivery driver pause at the cafe across the street. He unloaded crates without hurry, while two young men at the corner table stole glances his way. They weren't aggressive, but Amara could see it in their posture, the familiar tilt of the head. The unspoken question that lingered too long. Why him? Why here? It's never really about the room, Amara said softly. It's about what follows you inside. Marcus followed her gaze to the street below. The two men at the cafe returned to their drinks, and the driver continued his work, unaffected. But Amara knew better. He had felt it. Later that morning, Amara stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the gold pin on the lapel of her navy blazer. The silk scarf around her neck was tied loosely, and her heels tapped softly against the floor as she moved. Marcus watched from the armchair by the window, fastening his cufflinks. You look like you own the place, he said with a grin. Amara's eyes met his in the mirror. That's the point, isn't it? By the time they arrived at the corporate headquarters, the sun had risen fully, bathing the marble floors in light that pooled beneath Amara's heels. Alina's assistant greeted them with polite efficiency, but Amara noted the slight edge in her tone. There was always a tone. Ms. Russo will meet you shortly, the assistant said, guiding them toward the lounge. Amara sat down, crossing her legs carefully, while Marcus flipped through emails on his phone. Across the room, two other executives whispered, their eyes darting in her direction. They didn't hide it well. See them? Marcus murmured without looking up. Amara's lips curved faintly. They're practically shouting. She could feel the questions swirling between the marble walls. Who was she, exactly? Was she here by merit or by Marcus's influence? Was she ambitious, or simply too bold for her own good? This was the air she breathed. And as she sat there, calm and unbothered, she knew that even her stillness was a kind of rebellion. Alina's office was colder than Amara remembered. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, but the sunlight barely warmed the space. Elena stood when they entered, gesturing toward the seats across from her desk. Her silver hair gleamed under the soft overhead lights, and the sharp line of her suit jacket made her appear unshakable. Amara, Marcus, Elena said smoothly, thank you for coming. The meeting began without delay. Amara presented the refined pitch, every figure, every projection articulated with precision. Marcus added details when necessary. But this room belonged to Amara. Yet, even as she spoke, she felt it. The way Elena's eyes lingered too long on certain slides. The slight hesitation before agreeing to next steps. It wasn't resistance. It was caution. Elena was weighing more than the deal. She was measuring Amara. And Amara knew that no matter how well she presented, she could not change the weight of history pressing against that scale. When the presentation ended, Elena leaned back in her chair, fingers laced beneath her chin. You've made a compelling case, Elena said after a pause. But expansion at this scale carries risk. There will be questions from our partners. Amara's eyes narrowed slightly. Questions about the numbers, or about me? Elena's lips tightened, not in offense, but in recognition. We operate in circles that value familiarity, Elena admitted. Sometimes that familiarity takes time to build. Amara smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. I understand, she said, her voice steady, but I wasn't planning to wait for familiarity to catch up. My brand was built by challenging what's familiar. Elena studied her carefully, as if searching for weakness in the seams. But there was none, because Amara Lewis did not break. When they left the office, Marcus's hand brushed lightly against Amara's. That was bold, he said. It was necessary, Amara replied. As they stepped out onto the sunlit street, Amara knew the decision would not come today. But the echoes of the meeting lingered not just in Elena's office, but in the quiet halls and whispered conversations that would follow. And Amara would be waiting. Paris wore the evening like an old coat frayed at the edges, yet timeless in the way it wrapped itself around those who walked its streets. The hotel lobby hummed softly with quiet conversations, the clink of silverware echoing faintly from the bar. Amara Lewis sat near the window, watching the city lights bloom against the darkening sky. Marcus was beside her, thumbing through emails, but his attention flickered toward her every few moments. He recognized that look, the distant stare that meant Amara's mind wasn't in the room. You're thinking about the meeting, he said, not looking up. Amara exhaled slowly. I'm thinking about what wasn't said. Marcus set his phone down and leaned back in his chair. Elena will come around, he said, but there was hesitation beneath the reassurance. Amara glanced at him. the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. "You don't believe that. I want to," Marcus admitted, "but I know how these things work." So did Amara. The room could nod politely, smile at the right moments. And still, the answer could arrive in a neat email that began with, "After careful consideration." It was the oldest trick in the book, respectability as a shield. But Amara wasn't angry. Not tonight. Anger was too costly, and she had learned to spend it sparingly. She sipped from her glass, letting the sharpness of the wine pull her back into the present. Across the room, two businessmen spoke in hushed tones, both of them dressed in crisp suits that blended seamlessly with the decor. One of them laughed, leaning slightly toward the other. But Amara caught at the glance in her direction, the slight narrowing of the eyes. It was fleeting, but she'd spent her life recognizing that particular brand of curiosity. Marcus followed her gaze. "You want me to say something?" he asked quietly. Amara shook her head. "No, because I will," he added, with a little more weight this time. Amara smiled. "I know." The businessmen turned back to their conversation, unaware or unconcerned that their brief acknowledgement had been noticed. That was the thing about prejudice, it didn't need to scream. It whispered. It brushed past you in lobbies, in boardrooms, in the moments between handshakes. "You ever wonder," Amara said softly, setting down her glass, "how often we've been the topic of someone else's side conversation?" Marcus shrugged. "I try not to think about it. I can't stop thinking about it," Amara replied. Her voice was calm, but Marcus could hear the edge beneath it, the edge that had been sharpened over years of sitting at tables where she was both present and dismissed in the same breath. The next morning arrived cold and bright. Amara stood near the hotel window, watching the streets below as Paris stretched awake. Marcus was still asleep, his arm draped over the pillow beside him, his breathing soft and even. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. Elena Russo. Amara stared at the name for a moment before answering. "Good morning, Amara." Elena's voice was polite, but clipped. "I wanted to follow up on yesterday's meeting." Amara crossed the room, her gaze fixed on the rooftops outside. "I appreciate the call," she said evenly. Elena paused just long enough for Amara to brace herself. "We've decided to move forward with a different partner," Elena said. "It was a difficult decision, but ultimately, we felt their proposal aligned more closely with our market." Amara nodded slowly, though Elena couldn't see her. "I see," Amara replied, her tone carefully neutral. Elena hesitated, as if waiting for Amara to press to ask what part of the proposal hadn't fit, to demand an explanation that would never be offered outright. But Amara had no interest in making it easier. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said. "I'm sure we'll cross paths again." Elena's voice softened, as if sensing the shift. "I'm certain of it." And Amara, "Yes? You were impressive," Elena said. "Truly, this wasn't a reflection of." "It never is," Amara interrupted gently. Elena fell silent for a moment. "Take care, Amara." The call ended with the softest click. But Amara didn't set the phone down right away. She had known this was coming. Marcus stirred behind her, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Was that Elena?" Amara nodded. "And? She chose someone else." Marcus frowned, pushing the sheets aside as he sat on the edge of the bed. "I can talk to her." Amara smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No, you can't." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Amara cut him off with a glance. "She made her decision," Amara said quietly, "and she'll live with it." Marcus watched her carefully, reading between the lines. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." "Then why does it feel like you lost something?" Amara didn't answer right away. "Because it wasn't the deal. It was the principle of it." She could fight her way into the room, present flawlessly, and still, the door would close without explanation. Marcus stood, crossing the room until he stood behind her, resting his hands gently on her shoulders. "You'll get the next one," he said softly. Amara exhaled, leaning into his touch. "That's not the point." "I know," Marcus replied. And he did. They stood there for a long time, watching the city. The world outside was full of doors that didn't always open, but Amara had learned something else. Something Hayes and Elena and all the others hadn't accounted for. She didn't need their doors. She would build her own. The evening sky over Paris stretched wide and restless, smudged with the last traces of daylight. Amara Lewis sat alone at the corner of a quiet cafe, stirring the foam in her coffee long after it had settled. The streets were alive with footsteps and laughter. Yet she felt apart from it, as if watching the world from behind glass. Marcus had left that morning for meetings across the city, leaving her with hours to fill and too much silence in between. The rejection from Elena Russo lingered, not as a fresh wound, but as something deeper, an echo of a song Amara had heard too many times before. This wasn't new. She had learned to live with the weight of these moments, to fold the disappointment neatly and tuck it somewhere out of sight. But even as she sat beneath the golden glow of Paris, something about this time felt different. It wasn't the loss of the deal. It was the quiet certainty that the decision had been made before she even entered the room. Across the square, an elderly woman walked briskly, one hand gripping the leash of a large, unruly dog. The animal pulled ahead, weaving through the crowd, but the woman held firm, her steps steady, unrelenting. Amara watched her for a long moment, fascinated by the sheer simplicity of the act. To stand one's ground, to hold the line, even when the weight pulled forward. She smiled faintly to herself, shaking her head. How strange, she thought, that resistance could look like something so ordinary. That evening, Marcus returned, his expression careful as he placed his briefcase by the door. Amara didn't ask about his meetings. She already knew how they had gone. Instead, she poured him a drink, settling beside him on the balcony. The lights of the Eiffel Tower shimmered in the distance, but Marcus seemed far away, staring at the glass in his hand as if searching for answers at the bottom. Elena's loss, Marcus said finally, his tone light but edged with frustration. Amara laughed softly under her breath. You don't believe that? Marcus glanced at her. No, he admitted, but I want to. They sat in silence, the city stretching out before them. She'll regret it, Marcus added after a while, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. Maybe not today, maybe not even this year. But she will. Amara's gaze drifted beyond the rooftops, to the dark shapes of buildings pressed against the horizon. Regret, she said quietly, doesn't sign contracts. Marcus turned toward her, studying the faint curve of her profile beneath the soft light. So, what now? Amara took a slow breath, letting it linger in the space between them. We keep going, she said simply. Marcus nodded, but she could see the doubt flicker in his eyes. I mean it, Amara pressed, her voice firm. This wasn't the first locked door, and it won't be the last. But the thing about doors, she paused, letting the words settle, is that you can build new ones. Marcus smiled faintly, shaking his head. You always know how to make it sound easy. It isn't, Amara replied, but that's the point. The next morning, Amara sat at the desk in their hotel suite, scrolling through a list of investors Marcus had sent over. Names she recognized, some she didn't. She drafted emails, refined proposals, and by noon, her calendar was fuller than it had been in weeks. But it wasn't just the meetings that filled the space. It was the quiet resolve beneath each message, each call a reminder that the world did not stop simply because one door had closed. By late afternoon, she had arranged 2 follow-ups with smaller European firms interested in emerging fashion markets. The names didn't carry the weight of Russo Holdings, but Amara had long learned that sometimes, the smallest cracks were enough to split stone. When Marcus returned that evening, she met him at the door, phone in hand, already speaking to a potential partner. Marcus raised a brow, silently mouthing, "Who is it?" Amara smirked, holding up a finger as she wrapped up the call. When she hung up, Marcus folded his arms, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You move fast," he said. Amara slipped her phone into her pocket. "I don't wait for doors to open." Marcus, his smile grew wider. "No," he said, shaking his head, "you don't." 2 weeks later, Amara stood before the entrance of a sleek, modern office in London. The rain had just begun to fall, light and steady, speckling the marble steps beneath her feet. Marcus stood beside her, umbrella in hand. As they stepped inside, Amara felt it again, that familiar shift in the air. The receptionist looked up, offering a polite, professional smile, but there it was, flickering just beneath the surface, the subtle hesitation, the brief pause in recognition. The question. Amara straightened, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached. "I'm Amara Lewis," she said, her voice unwavering. "I have a 2 p.m. with Mr. Caldwell." The receptionist nodded, typing briskly. "Yes, Mrs. Lewis, Mr. Caldwell is expecting you. Please take the elevator to the 10th floor." As the doors slid open, Marcus glanced at Amara. his hand resting lightly at her back. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. Amara stepped inside, pressing the button. "I've been ready," she replied. And as the elevator rose, she felt it that small, persistent tug at the edge of her thoughts. Not doubt. The weight of all the locked doors behind her. And the certainty that somewhere ahead, another one was already swinging open.